Good morning, everybody. So good to have you here today for week number 2 in this series called The Road. And whether you're joining us today at our Clark Summit campus or in Wilkes-Barre or in Dixon City, wherever you happen to be today as you hear and see this message, my hope and my prayer is that the next few minutes we spend together will be meaningful and encouraging and perhaps even life-changing for you. And the only way I believe that will happen is if you allow God to open up your heart and for you to receive the truth that He has for us today, wherever you may be today as you hear that truth. But great to have you here for this series. And this series, as we make our way to Easter, this series is focused on the road that Jesus walked during that final week of His life. It was a road that began on the outskirts of Jerusalem and a road that took Him all the way to the cross. And we began this series last week by saying that really all of us are on a road. Every single one of us is on a journey from where we used to be to the people that we will eventually become. But here's the thing, if you're a Christian, you are called to walk a very specific road. In fact, there was a 2-word invitation, a simple invitation that Jesus would give over and over in the Bible. He would simply say this. He would say, "Follow me." You know, Jesus never went up to somebody and said, "Become a Christian." In fact, He never used that word. He would simply say, "Follow me." And He didn't say follow a system or follow a set of rules or follow these rituals. He just said, "Follow me." And so to be a Christian really means that you are a follower of Jesus, which means this, that every morning we have to get up and we have to figure out what it means for us to join Him on this journey, for us to follow the path that He walked. It means that we have to figure out what it means for us to live our lives the way He would live our lives if He were living our lives for us, because He does live within us. And so the road is all about following Jesus on the path that He's called us to walk. And during this series, we're looking at the road He walked, and specifically the road that He walked in the final week of His life. And as we talk about that final week and the road that He walked, we're talking about 5 experiences that Jesus had, 5 things that He faced on that final week of His life, on that road that led Him to the cross. So last week, we talked about distraction. Today, we'll talk about betrayal. We'll continue this series next week talking about dread, and then the week after that we'll talk about loneliness as everyone deserted Him in His hour of greatest pain. And then in the final week of this series we'll talk about the one thing that compelled Him to walk this road for you and for me, and that was His love for us. And what's so interesting to me is that Jesus lived out in that 7-day period of time so many of the things that we experience during our lifetime in its entirety. It was just compressed into a week for Him. And as we observe how He walked through distraction and betrayal and dread and loneliness, and as He walked in love, as we observe what happened to Him in the final week of His life, it tells us how we ought to walk throughout our lives as we follow Him on this same road. So today, we're going to talk about betrayal, and we're going to talk about the most famous betrayal in history. And I think that one of the deepest pains in every human heart is the pain of betrayal. When somebody you trust lets you down, when somebody you care about and someone that you thought cared about you kind of turns their back on you and does something to deeply wound you or disappoint you. And I would guess that most of us hearing this message, most of us on every campus, have lived long enough to feel the sting of betrayal to some degree. For some of you, it was the person who promised to love you forever. But then somebody more attractive came along and he, walked out on you, or she walked out on you. For some of you, the betrayal came from a friend, somebody who knew you very well, but then they took what they knew about you and they used that against you. Maybe for you, that betrayal came from a coworker or a business partner, and they did something that was a betrayal to you. They took advantage of you. For some of you, your betrayal dates all the way back to when you were a child, because you had a parent or parents who didn't love you and who didn't parent you the way that they should have. And so you felt a sense of betrayal, and you still feel the sting of that even today. For some of you, if we're honest, some of you felt betrayed or hurt by a church somewhere along the line, and you kind of checked out of church and maybe even checked out from your relationship with God, and now you're kind of trying to make your way back, which is a really big deal for you because you were gone for so long. And let me just say that I'm glad you're trying to overcome that betrayal. So I don't know what it's been in your life, but I think all of us have probably lived long enough to feel the pain of betrayal to one degree or another. But here's the thing. The way that you respond to betrayal will determine whether or not you continue on the road that God has called you to walk, because so often the pain of betrayal can push us into a ditch somewhere as we get consumed with bitterness and self-pity. And I'll tell you what, I've talked to many, many people over the years who've been kind of derailed from the road that they should be on because they are so preoccupied with the past that they can't move forward into the future. So we're going to talk about betrayal. And as you know, I was thinking about betrayal, I couldn't help but remember a news article I read a couple of years ago about a very interesting museum. It's called the Museum of Broken Relationships. This place really does exist. And this museum is a collection of objects that are somehow connected to a romantic relationship that went bad. And when they opened this museum, what they did was they invited people to send in, items or object that had some connection to a broken relationship, and they could donate them to this museum as a way of getting rid of them and maybe even getting rid of some of the pain. And some very interesting things. At any given time, there are about 1,000 items in this museum. I'll show you a few examples. There's this Frisbee that came with a note that said this: "A stupid Frisbee bought in a thrift store was my ex-boyfriend's brilliant idea as a second anniversary gift." Now, for some of you guys here today, this may be the reason why God wanted you to come to church today, okay? Don't buy the Frisbee for the anniversary gift. I may have just saved your relationship. You're welcome. Another interesting object in the Museum of Broken Relationships is this garden gnome. And the story behind this is that it was sent in by a woman whose husband left her for another woman, and as he was pulling out of the driveway for the very last time, she hurled this at the car, busted the windshield, never saw the guy again. And one more object, there's this watch that was submitted to the museum, and it came with a note, and the note said this. It said, "The first time my ex told me he loved me, he took off my watch and pulled the pin out to mark the time that he said it. And after that, I could never bring myself to push it back in or wear it again. But had I known then that he was only ever going to steal my time, I would have pushed it back in and walked away instead of waiting too many years for my life to start again." As I thought about the Museum of Broken Relationships, I couldn't help but think that that's a pretty good image, a pretty accurate picture of the way that so many people handle the pain in their lives. We create kind of a museum in our minds, and we hold on to the hurt, and we display it, and we revisit it every so often, and we never forget. And anyone who will listen, we take them on a tour of the museum of our broken relationships and show them everything that's been done to us. And, I've seen so many people who get consumed by the bitterness and the hurt, and it just kind of stalls them in life, and they never move forward. So today we're going to look at how Jesus responded to betrayal, because I think if we can understand how he responded to the hurt and the betrayal in his life, it'll help us to know how to respond to it in a way that will allow us to move forward on the road that we've been called to walk. So let me tell you right up front where we're going. One big idea that I hope you'll take away, and this will make a little bit more sense by the time that we get done, but what I hope you can understand today is this: that when someone does something to you that you don't deserve, do something for them that they don't deserve. Now you're going to push back a little bit on that, and you're going to say, well, you don't know my story, and I would never do that. But just kind of hang with me and let this simmer a little bit as we talk through the betrayal that Jesus experienced. And in a few minutes, I think this will really begin to make some sense and to resonate with you. Okay, we're going to jump in today in John 13. There are 4 Gospels, 4 biographies of the life of Jesus. All of them talk about this betrayal, but I want to focus today on John's particular perspective and his account of the betrayal of Judas. So if you have a Bible, you can open up to John 13 or bring that up on a phone or on a mobile device. Also, take that connection card out that you received when you came in and use that as a way to take some notes. Now, just to give you some context, let me walk you through a timeline for this final week of Jesus, okay? We began last week by talking about what happened on Sunday as Jesus and his disciples entered the city of Jerusalem. And as they entered the city, there was this crowd of people that was waving palm branches, a symbol of power and victory, and they were saying, "Hosanna," which means "save us." And what they were really shouting for Jesus to do was to rescue them from the Roman oppression and to give them back their freedom as a nation, to restore their dignity. But see, Jesus had not come to address a political problem. He had come to address a spiritual problem. And that becomes obvious even on Monday, because the very first thing he does on Monday is he goes in and he cleanses the temple, meaning this: Jesus didn't come into Jerusalem, go to the Roman garrison, and kick out the Roman soldiers. He goes to the Jewish temple and kicks out the religious leaders, essentially saying, you've got to understand why I'm here. I am here to address the spiritual darkness that y'all are dealing with, not to address a political situation. So that happens on Monday. Tuesday, Jesus goes to a mountain nearby called the Mount of Olives, and he spends the entire day there teaching about God's kingdom and about what the future would hold for him. And then it was on Wednesday that Judas goes to the religious leaders and plots with them to betray Jesus. Here's how it went down, Luke chapter 22. Judas went to the chief priests and the officers of the temple guard and discussed with them how he might betray Jesus. They were delighted and agreed to give him money. He consented and watched for an opportunity to hand Jesus over to them when no crowd was present. And by the way, that's why Judas was so important to this. Because remember, the city of Jerusalem at this point was overflowing with people. And Jesus was very, very popular with the common people. And so the religious leaders, they didn't want to try to arrest Jesus in public because that would have created a riot and that would have been a problem. So they had to wait until he was alone and away from the crowds. And so they needed somebody on the inside who could tip them off to a good time to come and arrest Jesus. And Judas was the man who would do that. So it's on Wednesday that Judas strikes that deal for 30 pieces of silver to betray Jesus. So we're going to pick up the story today on Thursday. Thursday evening is when Jesus and the disciples gathered together for one last meal. We call it today the Last Supper. It was actually a Passover meal that they shared together. So John chapter 13, beginning in verse 2, here's what it says. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Now, whenever we imagine this scene of the Last Supper, for many, many people, this is the kind of image that comes to mind right here, okay? This is Da Vinci's painting of the Last Supper, which is kind of cool how they all got on one side of the table for the picture, isn't it? I mean, this is like history's first selfie right here. Okay, now, if that's your image of what happened in that upper room, you kind of have to erase that image because it looked something more like this. In those days, when they would share a meal together, they would share it around a table that was about 18 inches off the floor, not sitting in chairs like we do today. And everyone would lie on a mat or on a rug, and you would lean on your left arm and you would eat with your right hand. Okay, this is how meals were served and eaten in those days. Now, let me give you a typical seating chart for a meal like this. People would sit on three sides of the table, and oftentimes there'd be a U-shaped table. It was called a triclinium, so that the food could be served from the center. And the host for the meal would always sit in this position. And then on each side of the host, there would be two seats that would be reserved for honored guests. And so if you were seated on the left or the right of the host, that means that you were one of the honored guests in the gathering at the meal that evening. Now, one other detail that's very, very important, and that's this. In those days, not everybody had their individual, place setting. 2 or 3 people around the table would always share dishes. And if you were one of the honored guests, you would always share a dish and a plate with the host. And that was seen as a privilege, by the way. That was seen as an honor. We don't see it that way in our culture today, but in that culture, it was seen as an honor to share the food of the host because that was a sign that he trusted you. That was a sign that you had a close relationship with him. Now, kind of a corollary example from today's world, it's like if you go out for dinner And after dinner's over, you order dessert, okay? And when you order dessert, you say to your wife, you say, honey, do you want some dessert also? And she says, no, I'm kind of full. I don't want any dessert. So you get your dessert, you get your cheesecake that you've ordered, and as you eat your dessert, your wife eats half of your dessert off of your plate. Totally hypothetical situation, strictly hypothetical. But you're okay with her doing that because you have a close relationship, because you love her. And it was the same thing in that culture, that if you were one of the honored guests, you would share dishes, you would share a plate with the host, okay? So keep all of those details in mind, because all of those details are very important to understanding what happens in that room that night. So let's skip to verse 21. And Jesus makes this incredibly shocking announcement. Verse 21, Jesus was troubled in spirit and testified. He said, very truly, I tell you, one of you is going to betray me. Now, you have to understand how shocking that would have been to the others around that table. I mean, they had spent 3 years together. They had been traveling together. They had been working together. They had seen incredible things together. I mean, these guys, they had all their inside jokes, and they had their memories, and they had their stories they would tell, around the campfire at night. Like, do you remember that guy, that kid with the lunch that he brought, and we fed 5,000 people with it? Yeah, man, that was so amazing. You remember that time out in the storm, Peter, when you walked on the water? Yeah, and you started screaming. I wasn't screaming. Yeah, you were screaming like a little girl. Well, I might have been screaming, but you never got out of the boat, They had all these shared memories and these stories that they shared together because they were a band of brothers. But then Jesus says, one of you is going to betray me. And you got to understand that this betrayal affected the hearts of the disciples probably almost as much as it affected the heart of Jesus, and they were shocked by this. And then they had no idea who it could be. It goes on to say this, his disciples stared at one another, at a loss to know which one of them he meant. In Matthew's gospel, Matthew adds a little bit to it. He said they were very sad and began to say to him one after another, surely not I, Lord. Like they're all asking, is it me? Am I going to be the one who caves into the pressure? They had no idea who it was that was going to betray Jesus, which is very interesting to me because if you watch like a movie about the life of Jesus, you can always pick out Judas, can't you? I mean, the character Judas in the movie, he's always like, has that devious look and kind of disheveled clothes and the beady eyes and never smiles, and he's like kind of in the shadows all the time. But I don't think that's accurate. Judas fit in with everybody else. Nobody suspected that Judas would be the one to betray Jesus. They had no idea it was him. In fact, Judas was actually, as we're going to find out in a minute, the treasurer for the group. He managed the money. Who do you give your money to? You give it to somebody who's trustworthy, somebody who's loyal. They had no idea that Judas would be the one who would betray Jesus Christ, which made the betrayal all that much more painful because they never saw it coming. Because he looked so good, he looked so loyal, he pretended to be one of them. And so Peter, verse 23, or John, has a question. One of them, the disciple whom Jesus loved, and it's interesting because John, when he writes this gospel, never uses his own name. He always describes himself this way, the disciple whom Jesus loved, like he never got over that. So he was reclining next to him, next to Jesus. Simon Peter motioned to this disciple and said, ask him which one he means. So apparently Simon Peter is sitting like across the table, and he says, John, ask him which one he means. Like he's motioning to him, okay? Leaning back against Jesus, he asked him, Lord, who is it? So John, excuse me, the disciple whom Jesus loved was reclining next to him. So he's sitting right next to him, leans back against him, which means that he would have been sitting to his right. He kind of leans back, probably whispers, and says, Lord, who is it? So go back to that seating chart. So we know that John would have been seated right here. He asks a question to Jesus. Verse 26, Jesus responds. Jesus answered, probably only speaking to John. He said, it is the one to whom I will give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish. Then, dipping the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. As soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered into him. So Jesus told him, "What you're about to do, do quickly." But no one at the meal understood why Jesus had said this to him. Since Judas had charge of the money, some thought Jesus was telling him to buy what was needed for the festival or to give something to the poor. As soon as Judas had taken the bread, he went out, and it was night. It was night literally, and it was night spiritually for Judas. And a few hours later, he would lead the soldiers to the garden where Jesus was praying. Now, if you look carefully at this story, you see how Jesus handled this betrayal in an incredible way. He handled it in such a way, which is a lesson to us, that doesn't derail us from the road, but allows us to process that hurt in a way that doesn't lead to bitterness and self-pity. So let me go back to that principle. That's kind of the big idea, the big takeaway. When someone does something to you that you don't deserve, do something for them that they don't deserve. Now you say, well, Mark, that's an interesting idea, but how do you get that out of everything that we just read in John chapter 13? Well, let me point out a few details, okay? So go back to verse 26. When Jesus answered, "It is the one to whom I will give this piece of bread when I've dipped it in the dish." So he's responding to John. Then dipping the piece of bread, which in those days, bread was like their silverware, so they would dip that in to get the food. Dipping the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. So we'll go back to kind of the seating chart thing, okay? So we know that Jesus would have sat here as the host. We know that John was sitting here. Judas dipped into the same dish that Jesus did, so that tells us that Judas would have been sitting here. Now that to me is incredible, because I believe that Jesus knew before that evening that Judas was going to betray him. And yet when he invites them in, and he invites two people to sit in these places of honor, he invites John and Judas to sit next to him. See, Jesus does not ignore the betrayal. He calls it out. And yet at the same time, he still treats his betrayer with a sense of honor. But then there was something else that happened that evening as well. If you know the story, you know that before they ever shared in that meal together, after they had arrived in that private room, Jesus washed the feet of his disciples. Because in those days, when you walked anywhere, you walked with open-toed footwear, sandals, and the streets were not paved, they were mud, and animals used the same streets as human beings did, so that added another very interesting element to everything. And so when you arrived somewhere, especially if you were going to have a meal, you had to wash your feet. But typically there would be a servant who would do that. But there was no servant in the room that night. And so Jesus, the most important person in the room, the Son of God, plays the role of a servant. Verse 5, Jesus poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. Here's my question. When Jesus washed the feet of his disciples, did he skip over Judas? No, he didn't. I would have. I think I would have just skipped Judas because I would have been so, resentful knowing what he was about to do. Or maybe I would have washed his feet, but I would have broken a couple of toes in the process. Jesus doesn't do that. He washes the feet of his betrayer. He washes the very feet that will lead the soldiers to the garden where Jesus would be arrested. See, when someone does something to you that you don't deserve, do something for them that they don't deserve. But this is not easy, is it? I mean, this goes against everything culture tells us. This goes against everything our heart is telling us when we've been hurt. What we want to do is when someone does something to us that we don't deserve, we want to do something back to them that they deserve, and we want them to feel the pain that we felt. I think for me, the best picture, the best kind of image of how most of us handle anger is that digital game Angry Birds. Did you ever play Angry Birds? I mean, this is like the best-selling digital game of all time. It's been downloaded over 1 billion times onto phones and tablets and all that stuff. But here's the plot of Angry Birds, in case you've never played it. In Angry Birds, there are these pigs, and the pigs, they steal some eggs from the birds. And then the pigs in their hats over here, they build these structures, and then they start to laugh. And of course, that makes the angry birds very angry. But see, what the angry birds have is they have a catapult. And so what you do with the game is you catapult the birds into the structure, and you try to destroy the structure that the pigs are in. But here's the problem. Do you know what happens to the birds after they get catapulted into the structure? They die. Yeah, they just kind of roll around and then they blow up. And I've always thought, you know what, that's a pretty good picture of how most of us handle anger. We just have been hurt by someone else, and we want to hurt them back, and so we lash out at them and we try to damage them. But in trying to damage them, what we ultimately do is we damage ourselves emotionally and spiritually. There's a better option. When someone does something to you that you don't deserve, do something for them that they don't deserve. Because here's why. I think that is the only way to be set free from the hurt and the potential bitterness and self-pity that come when we feel like someone has betrayed us. And in that upper room that night, I think that Jesus was simply practicing what he had taught a couple of years before that. In Matthew chapter 5, what we commonly call the Sermon on the Mount, here's what he said to us. He said, listen, you've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. So think about that person in your life who is the most difficult to love, who has hurt you most deeply, who has perhaps even betrayed you. That enemy, what would it look like for you to love your enemy? Maybe it just starts with praying for them. Maybe that's where you have to start. And you'll start praying for them through clenched teeth and with clenched fist, and maybe you're going to start by praying that God will just strike them dead. I don't know, but it's something. You got to start somewhere, and eventually as you pray for them, I believe that God will soften your heart. And then maybe the next step is just when you talk about them, to speak kindly about them. Like when somebody brings up their name, you don't say, well, let me tell you the truth about that person. Let me tell you what they did, and I've got proof. In fact, I've got a PowerPoint show. Let's bring it in, everybody. I'll just show it to you right now. You know, maybe just start by speaking kindly about them, or maybe even you move to the point where you do something for them to actually bless them. Maybe that's what loving your enemy means. Like maybe your enemy would be your ex-spouse. And there's so much pain there and there's so much hurt there, but then you find out that he or she is going through some financial challenges, and so maybe to love your enemy means that you write a check to help them. Or maybe, you know, your enemy is that coworker who stole your idea and who got your promotion. And maybe loving your enemy means that you just write that person a note of congratulations. Or maybe your enemy is your next door neighbor who stays up late into the night throwing wild parties with loud music so that you can't sleep. And maybe loving your enemy means that you just go over and you cut his grass for him at 5:30 in the morning. No, just kidding about that part. What does it look like to love your enemies? What does it look like when someone does something to you that you don't deserve, that you do something for them that they don't deserve? It's a great story. I think I've shared it with you before. It comes from a pastor in California. His name is Tim Brown. And this was his opportunity to do that. Here's what he writes. He says, some time ago, I was having lunch in McDonald's with my daughter and mother-in-law. We were enjoying a pleasant conversation with a man with his wife and children, sat down at a nearby table. The man was someone who in the past had hurt me. We faked pleasantries and exchanged hellos, but I could feel my blood begin to boil at the thought of what he had done to me. This person had wounded me badly, and I was surprised how much hurt I still felt. My family and I gobbled down our food, and on the way out of the restaurant, I overheard my enemy and his wife arguing because neither had any money to purchase the food they had ordered. Their 3 kids were screaming for their Happy Meals. The couple was embarrassed. My first thought was, praise God, there is justice in this world. He deserves every bit of the embarrassment he's feeling, and I'm so glad I got to see this. Suddenly, God spoke to me through the Bible verses I'd read that morning. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. On the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. I knew I had a choice, either to obey or bask in my bitterness. Somewhat reluctantly, I reached into my wallet, pulled out $20, and gave it to this man who had been my enemy. "Have lunch on me," I said, with tears in my eyes. What does it look like for you to love that person who has betrayed you? To some degree, small or great, what does it look like to love them? I'll tell you what, there is so much power in this. Power not only to change your own heart and to set you free, but power to impress upon other people the magnitude of God's love. I love the way that Robert Vaughn, an author, put it, or excuse me, his name is Vaughn Roberts. He said, when you love people who are like you, that's ordinary. When you love people who are unlike you, that's extraordinary. But when you love people who dislike you, that's revolutionary. And I'll tell you what, on this road that we have been called to walk as followers of Christ, we are not called to live ordinary lives. An ordinary life is where you love people who love you right back. An ordinary life is where you are nice to people who are nice back to you. But when you love people who have hurt you, that is revolutionary. Now, you might say, well, Mark, it's easy for you to say, easy for you to talk about, easy for you to give a message about, but you don't know my story. You don't know the pain that I felt. You don't know what I'm facing or what it would take for me to do that. And let me tell you where you find the power to respond the way that Jesus responded. Here's what you do. You remember that the road that Jesus walked was a road that led him all the way to a cross. And he went to that cross for you, and he went there for me. Because when we read this story, we need to see ourselves in Judas, because I believe there is a betrayer that lurks inside every single one of us. See, I know in my life, in spite of the fact that I grew up in a good Christian home and I went to a Christian college and I do what I do, I know in my life there are times when I betray my Savior. There are times when I turn my back on Him. There are times when I forsake Him for some kind of inferior pursuit. And here's what we need to understand. Despite the fact that we have done something to Him that He doesn't deserve, He does something for us every day that we don't deserve. And that is He extends to us His grace. I love the way it said in Colossians chapter 1. It says, once you were alienated from God, you were the Judas, you were the betrayer, and you were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior, speaking to believers. But now He has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in His sight, without blemish and free from accusation. See, Jesus walked down a road that went all the way to a cross, so that by His death and His physical body we could be reconciled, even though we all, as a human race, had turned our backs on God. And the message of the gospel is this: that God loved us while we were still His enemies. And because of His love, He turned us from His enemies into His adopted sons and daughters. And so in closing, let me speak to two groups of people. Let me speak first of all to those of you who just need to receive forgiveness. Maybe you're not even really a follower of Christ. You're not sure you're even on the road that's called the road of being a follower. And what you need to understand, first of all, is that there's no way for you to earn your way into God's good favor. That all of us are like Judas. All of us are like Peter. We've denied knowing Christ. All of us, by our actions, to some degree, have walked the other way. But Jesus died to reconcile us so that we could be forgiven. He gave us what we do not deserve, which is grace. And all you need to do is reach out and accept that grace. And I'll give you a chance to do that today. If you never before have understood what it means to be fully forgiven and embraced, and if you think you're too bad to be forgiven, that's just not true. I want to give you a chance to accept that forgiveness today. On every campus, just close your eyes, kind of tune out the world around you and the people around you. And if you've never taken this step of just confessing with your heart and with your mind your desire to be a follower of Christ, I want to give you a chance to do that with a simple prayer that could go just something like this. Just pray this right there in your own seat. Lord Jesus, thank you for coming into this world and walking a road that led you to a cross to pay the price for my sin and my betrayal. Today I commit my life to you as my forgiver and my leader. And from this day forward, I will follow you and live in your grace, which I know I will still need. Amen. And let me just say this, if you've made that heartfelt, honest commitment to Christ, that's the first step, not the last step. And there are a lot of steps still on this road that He's called you to follow Him. And one of the best next steps is baptism. Baptism is where you just take that faith in your heart, you go public with it, and we all get to celebrate with you. Go online when you get home, find out what baptism is all about. Stop out at the Next Steps area, talk to somebody about baptism, because we have baptism coming up on Easter. No better day to get baptized than Easter, so we'd love to include you in that. So some of you today just received forgiveness. Many of us here today have received forgiveness, but we're having a hard time giving forgiveness to someone else. And if you have a hard time forgiving and loving your enemy, here's why. It's probably because you're only focusing on what was done to you instead of what was done for you. And what we have to do every day if we're going to stay on this road, even in the face of betrayal, is we got to put our eyes every day on a blood-stained Roman cross where we got something we didn't deserve. We got grace. And if God was willing to give us what we don't deserve, then we should be willing in those times when someone else does something to us that we don't deserve, that we should be willing to give them something and do something for them that they don't deserve, which is to love them and to forgive them and to pray for them and to bless them. I know it's hard, but as we focus our attention on the cross, we'll be able to do that. And today, as we end our time together, we're going to do just that. We're going to think about the cross, and we're going to think about grace, because really, when you realize who we were without God, we realize that His grace is absolutely amazing. I'm going to have the band come on back up on all three campuses as we close with that song, Amazing Grace. For now, let me have you stand with me on every campus, and let me just close with you in prayer. God, we thank you for your grace. I pray that that would define us. I pray that your grace and your love would guide us every day as we walk this path as followers of Christ. And in those times when we come up against hurt and pain and betrayal, may we respond to others the way that you've treated us, with incredible, amazing grace. And I pray that in Christ's name. Amen.